Hey guys, tonight we drift into something so oddly specific, so fantastically dull, that your brain may very well give up and wander off to dreamland before we're halfway through the first name. Imagine this: a cold morning in a wind-swept valley of medieval Iceland, mist curling off the grass like breath from sleeping animals. The sun isn't even trying. It's just sort of glowing faintly behind clouds that look like they gave up on snow. You wake wrapped in wool, the kind that's been remended so many times it probably qualifies as its own relative. And outside your turf-roofed hut, you hear it. Not a rooster crowing, not church bells. No, just goats, braying, bleating. One. Sounds like it's saying Ragnar, which is either a coincidence or very bad news. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here for fame. I'm here for sleep, awkward facts, and the occasional goat. Drop your location and local time in the comments if you're still awake by the end of this sentence. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your knees creak as you stand and push open the wooden door. Outside, the world smells like frozen moss and animal fur. A few goats nose through patches of grass, their breath steaming. One nudges your leg. Her name is Brana, which means she who climbs on everything. And yes, you did name her that, after she ruined 3 baskets and your dignity. The naming of goats, you're beginning to realize, is more than a rural amusement in this place. It is serious business, and it always has been. You trudge toward the pen, stepping around puddles turned to ice, thinking of how many names you've given goats. Some good, some less than polite. Flatface comes to mind. Tail thief. And while you may have thought yourself clever, you also wonder if perhaps you've broken a law or two. A mainstream historical fact floats in, like a snowflake landing on your sleeve. In medieval Iceland, livestock ownership and animal naming weren't just casual matters. They were recorded, argued about, and yes, legislated. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, covered everything from murder to milking, and it did not skip over pet goats. The Gragas, by the way, translates roughly as grey goose laws, named not for their content, but for the color of the vellum. And if that sounds like the beginning of a bedtime fable about geese who also practice law, I apologize, but only a little. You lean against the low stone wall that pens in your goats, watching Brana attempt to eat the rope she's tied with. The others mill about, some with names given in jest, others inherited. Naming, it turns out, can grant a kind of informal legality. A goat that's named, recognized, and called in front of witnesses becomes more than livestock. It becomes evidence, identity, testimony. You don't just own a goat, you testify to it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Icelandic farmsteads had designated name givers, not just for babies, mind you, but for animals. Why? Because a well-named goat might be more memorable in court. Think about that. You're in the middle of a land dispute, and your argument hinges on whether your goat Blotten, Bloodtooth, was grazing on the right side of the boundary marker. The name helps people remember, especially if Bloodtooth was known for biting. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced uniformly across regions or were more like strong customs, blurry around the edges, but sharp when challenged. Was there a goat naming police? Probably not. But was there legal precedent for a brawl over an animal named Thief? Absolutely. You lift a wooden bucket to feed the animals, the cold stinging your fingers. One goat knocks into another and snorts dramatically. You sigh. Time to think of a new name for that one. Shoves much? Pushkin? Lord Cloven of Shove? No matter. You'll settle on something that sounds majestic in the moment, but feels embarrassing when shouted across the valley. That's the Icelandic way. And it's not just about pride. The laws were practical too. Imagine 2 farmers disputing a goat's ownership. If both named the goat something different, witnesses could be called. I've heard John call her Sooty Tail since spring, one might say. Bjorn never used a name, just whistled, says another. In a land without paper trails, a goat's name could be as legal as a land deed. And goats being goats do not help this process. They wander, they climb, they escape, and join rival herds just for fun. If a goat with a name wanders into someone else's field, that name may save it from becoming soup, or not, depending on how good the name is. A wind picks up, tugging your cloak tight. You glance back at your hut and wonder how much more complicated things will get if that white goat, the nameless one, starts answering to Loki. You make a mental note. Do not name a goat after a trickster god unless you're prepared to see it walk on the roof. You close the gate, listening to the crunch of snow beneath hooves, your breath joining the morning mist. Out here in this strange little corner of history, names carry more weight than they should. They protect, they provoke, they testify. And tomorrow, you might just rename Brana again, if she climbs onto the privy roof a third time. The cold settles into your boots as you walk the worn path toward the assembly hill. It's not exactly a bustling city center, just a patch of flattened grass where disputes are aired, judgments are passed, and yes, sometimes goats are discussed with surprising seriousness. The goats aren't allowed on the hill itself anymore, thanks to one too many incidents involving stolen scrolls and mysterious droppings. But their names echo there, carried by shepherds and shouted across stone markers like oaths or curses. Your fingers absently trace the carved lines of a wooden walking stick as you approach. You're not old, but the ground is slippery with frost, and besides, you're allowed to be dramatic. It's a naming matter after all. Today, a neighbor is petitioning to rename a goat after an insult, which by medieval Icelandic standards is practically a declaration of war. A mainstream historical fact. In the Icelandic Althing, the National Assembly, legal disputes included the ownership, mistreatment, or defamation of animals. You could, in theory, sue someone for naming your goat something slanderous, because livestock weren't just food or milk sources. They were wealth, labor, even status symbols. Naming them poorly was akin to defacing property or slandering a person's kin. You settle on a damp rock as voices begin to rise. Two men, both dressed in layered tunics, one indigo, one faded russet, stand at the center of a loose circle of villagers. The man in russet is agitated. His beard bristles like a pine branch in the wind. He accuses the other of calling his prized goat Knatlika, which means ball game. Which sounds harmless, unless you understand that the term was also slang for someone who bounced between owners or was not particularly useful. Let's say the insult lands harder if your goat is a she-goat who just gave birth to twins. There's a bit of snickering. A few people shift their weight. You lean closer, the breeze pulling at your hood. The man in indigo defends himself. She's quick, he says, runs like the ball in play. But his grin gives him away. The insult was real. The damage depends on whether the other man can prove it caused loss of milk, trade value, or reputation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Goats were sometimes used as dowry markers. If a man offered 3 goats for a bride, the names of the goats might be recorded to ensure they were the specific animals agreed upon. One saga even mentions a goat named Mjalta Blessa, literally, milking blessing, used in a land settlement. You wouldn't want someone to swap her out with Lefty, the goat who only gives milk on odd days and occasionally bites. Historians still argue whether such naming disputes were legally binding or just folk drama elevated by oral tradition. Was there an actual trial for goat defamation? Or are we reading too much into a poetic aside in the sagas? Then again, this is the same society that legally outlawed sorcery while also accepting seals as possible reincarnated humans. You make of that what you will. The dispute escalates briefly before an elder raises his hand and the group falls quiet. He's draped in a thick teal cloak, fastened with a bronze brooch shaped like a fish. His beard is white as goat's milk, and he clears his throat in a way that silences everything but the wind. Names, he says, are like stones. Once thrown, they can't be called back. Be sure your aim is worth it. Everyone nods, partly because it's wise and partly because that's what you do when the elder speaks in metaphors. You wonder what your goats are being called by the children of the village. Surely not their given names. Probably things like buttface and lick everything. Children, much like goats, do not care about legal ramifications. One woman offers a suggestion. The goat in question should be renamed in the presence of witnesses, given a name of honor and dignity. The man in russet nods solemnly. He declares, Her Solbrase Sunsheen, which is a lovely name for a goat, even one who bites. As the circle breaks up, people begin drifting back to their daily tasks. You stay seated a moment longer, watching the mist begin to lift from the grass. The goats themselves remain oblivious to their courtroom fame. But you? You're starting to see the world in new terms, that every name spoken holds weight, that even the smallest creature may carry legacy through the sound of syllables shaped by frozen air, and that if you ever call someone's goat lazy bones again, you better be ready to explain your reasoning before a crowd. You rise slowly, your legs stiff from sitting, and turn back toward the pens. On the way, you pass a carved post, worn, leaning, but clearly once important. It marks an old boundary, possibly disputed, possibly forgotten. You imagine two men standing there centuries ago, arguing over whether Thistle Ear belonged on one side or the other. The wind tugs at your sleeve. You swear you hear a faint bleat in the distance, followed by something that sounds very much like laughter. You return to the village just as the sun slants in a way that seems more opinionated than usual. Less morning glow and more, let's get to work, you lazy loaf. The goats are already awake, of course. They always are. There's one, in particular, that greets you with the intensity of a debt collector. Her name is Eldfrida, Fire Beloved, which sounds regal until you learn it was originally a sarcastic jab about her tendency to chew through anything remotely flammable. Baskets, firewood, the hem of your cloak. Nothing is safe. You unlatch the pen gate and step inside, brushing your fingers along the rough wood as you pass. The animals shuffle around you, bleating their complaints and greetings. It's time for feeding, and you've got a bucket of barley mash that smells like warm socks and ambition. A mainstream historical fact. In medieval Iceland, most households depended on livestock, not just for survival, but for their social standing. A well-named, well-behaved goat wasn't merely a pet. It was evidence of your household's order, your domestic prowess, an animal's productivity, temperament, and, yes, even its name could be a subtle way of signaling your place in the community. Eldfrida might not earn you respect, but Seaborg, a sea castle, just might. Of course, the goats themselves are indifferent. They leap, they snort, they knock over the bucket with the precision of a Viking siege crew. You sigh and scoop what's salvageable, muttering vague insults that technically count as slander if overheard by a particularly litigious neighbor. You think about renaming one of the twins. They were born during last month's Aurora storm, and while Hredur, frightened, and Ljomabumbur, Glowbelly, seemed appropriate in the moment, they now feel limiting. You pick up Glowbelly, who immediately licks your chin, and try to imagine a name that doesn't sound like a stomach condition. Here's a quirky tidbit. It wasn't uncommon for names, goat or human, to evolve over time in Iceland. You might be born Snorri but become Snorri the Fox after tricking a tax collector, or Snorri the Wet after falling into a fjord during a fishing duel. Animals got similar upgrades. A goat that survived a storm could become Thrumudir, Thunder Beast. A goat that bit a chieftain, Legend. Historians still argue whether these renamings were formalized with public announcements or just whispered changes passed through gossip and admiration. Either way, once the community adopted it, the new name stuck harder than goat spit on wool. You glance over to the edge of the pen, where the village scribe is crouched with a little scroll and an ink pot. His task today? Recording animal names for the spring tithe list. It's not just about who owns what, it's about whether you're entitled to claim relief during a hard winter, or whether you'll be expected to contribute extra butter to the chieftain's feast. He raises an eyebrow and asks, "Is she still Eldfrida then?" You hesitate. The goat in question is currently attempting to mount a bucket. "Yes," you reply slowly. "But maybe, let's spell it with a Y." Now he nods as if this is an important legal distinction. You watch as he carefully inscribes Eldfrida into the vellum. That's another layer to consider. Spelling. There's no fixed orthography here, just best guesses and local habits, which means that even a name's letters can carry power. A goat named Skioni in one region might be Skioni somewhere else. One means piebald, the other shady fellow. You'd better hope the scribe gets it right, or you might be claiming a goat you don't actually own, or worse, insulting one you do. You finish feeding, close the pen, and make your way toward the communal path that leads past the smithy. You're bringing wool to trade, but mostly you want to talk to the blacksmith's wife. She's something of a goat-name connoisseur, known for giving her animals names that tell stories. There's Storm Kisser, who was born during the biggest gale of the season and supposedly licked lightning, or Tail Ender, a small stubborn billy who only arrives after everyone else and eats the last of everything. You find her outside her house, mending a torn basket with hands stained from soot and berry dye. She greets you with a nod and a half smile, and you ask her outright, how does she choose? She pauses, pulls a strand of bark fiber tight and says, a name should carry its own weather. You blink. She shrugs. You should feel it when you say it, like wind or sunlight or stone. That's how you know it's true. There's something comforting about that. You try it in your head. Glowbelly doesn't feel like weather. Star Trotter, maybe. Frostblink. Wind Eater. Names that feel like the sky has something to say about them. You walk back toward your home with a handful of new ideas and a sack lighter than you intended. You've forgotten the wool, but you've gained insight. Maybe that's worth the trade. Along the way, you pass a pair of children who are constructing tiny goat-sized cloaks from old scraps. One goat is wearing a crown made of woven straw. You ask the name. They answer in unison, Queen Lickalot. You nod with the solemn gravity such a title demands. Back at your hut, you sit and dip a bit of charcoal into water, then scrawl new name ideas onto a flat stone by the door. Stormtuft, Meadowkick, Blossomfoot. The goats, lounging nearby, chew their cud and pretend not to care. But you notice one, the quiet one with the dark ears, watching you carefully. Maybe she's already chosen her name. Maybe you just haven't heard it yet. Later that afternoon, you find yourself standing beneath the low eaves of the longhouse, where a clump of elders are gathered like ancient moss. They are busy debating something with the hushed fervor of people who know their opinions carry weight. You sidle closer, pretending to inspect a patch of lichen on the wall, and catch a few phrases. Not suitable, the wrong season, and curiously, insufficient majesty. They're not discussing legal matters or weather omens. No, they're debating a goat's name. Specifically, whether young Thorleik's choice of Boo Boo for his prized white nanny goat brings sufficient dignity to her milk yield. A mainstream historical fact, Iceland's medieval legal code. The Gragas wasn't just a haphazard list of punishments. It was an intricate weave of laws that dictated everything from how long bread could be considered fresh to how insults were to be interpreted. And yes, this extended, if not explicitly then by implication, to the naming of animals. Naming practices weren't just cultural fluff. They played a key role in property rights, inheritance, and social obligation. A misnamed goat could, in theory, be contested in a legal assembly. One elder, a lean woman with braids wound like rope around her ears, shakes her head. "You don't name a goat after a stubbed toe," she mutters. Another argues that affection matters more than grandeur, especially if the goat in question is more prone to nuzzling than headbutting. You can't help but imagine a court trial over goat names, complete with parchment evidence, tearful testimony, and a goat wearing a wreath to win the judge's favor. A quirky tidbit. There is one recorded case, possibly apocryphal, but it's passed down with enough conviction, of two chieftains arguing over the rights to a goat named Fjalar Modir, Mountain Mother. The dispute grew so heated that it delayed the Althing, the National Assembly, by half a day. Fjalar Modir herself is said to have wandered into the crowd and eaten a magistrate's shoes. Historians still argue whether this account is symbolic, exaggerated, or simply a reflection of how seriously Icelanders took their animals and their names. As the elders continue arguing over Boo Boo's worthiness, you drift toward the field beyond the village where your neighbor's goats are grazing. One of them, a shaggy creature with eyes like ancient stones, is called Mistborn. You know this because it was announced last winter during a solstice gathering. A small ceremony was held with a berry wreath and a bit of honey drizzled on her horns. It was oddly beautiful. You wonder whether it's the name that has made her so poised, or if the name simply followed the goat's nature, like a good poem trailing after its own rhyme. You kneel and scratch her behind the ears. She does not move except to twitch slightly. You murmur Mistborn, and it feels heavy in your mouth. Not unpleasant, just full of some ancient, fog-laced dignity. Back at your hut, you decide to consult your own naming ledger. Yes, you keep one, scribbled in charcoal on flattened bark, each name followed by a quick note. Bit me, stole soap, sleeps upside down. You trace your finger over the list and pause at one. Frost Gobbler, an ambitious name for a goat that once fainted at the sight of snow. And so begins the delicate dance of rebranding. You spend the next hour watching each goat, waiting for something that feels poetic. You write down phrases like eats like a drumbeat and eyes like spilled ink, hoping that somewhere in the mix, a true name will surface. You even try saying a few aloud. Leaf Stumbler, you whisper to one. Too dramatic, you decide. Thistle Prince? The goat sneezes. You take it as a no. Eventually, you settle on one. Brimtail. It's not flashy, but it feels like morning wind and stubborn. Loyalty. Appropriate for the small brown goat who always trails the herd but never loses sight of them. You say it again. Brimtail. He looks up. You smile. You think of another historical wrinkle. In the early sagas, naming an animal was sometimes an act of binding, like placing a spell or forging a contract. The name was more than label. It was a recognition of essence. You couldn't name something you didn't understand. It would be disrespectful. There's a deep logic there. To name is to notice, to pay attention. Maybe that's why it takes so long to get it right. Evening drapes itself gently across the sky, and you find yourself back with the elders again, who are now calmly sipping skyr and trading stories. The boo-boo debate has cooled, mostly because Thorlek declared he was changing the name to Bobjala, bell cow, which sounds far more distinguished in Old Norse, even if the goat herself has been ringing her bell against the fence, in a way that sounds like mocking applause. You sit beside them and offer Brimtail as your own contribution to the day's nomenclature. The braided woman smiles, slow and approving. Weather in it, she says. Good. You think of all the names that might be spoken into the wind, carved into horn, or whispered to a goat under starlight. Each one a map, a moment, a memory, shaped into syllables. And tomorrow, someone else in the village will need help naming their new kid. The tradition continues. The next day, you're jolted from your goats and names reverie by a commotion near the village commons. A young boy, all knees and elbows, sprinting toward the central fire pit with something cradled in his arms. You think it might be a bundle of linen, but no, it bleats. It's a newborn goat, and not just any newborn. It's got a streak of white across its forehead that looks uncannily like the rune for luck, or maybe chicken. Runes are tricky like that. The boy, puffing from the run, explains that the goat was born just before dawn. This, according to his grandmother, means it may be gifted or cursed, depending on which ancestor you ask. You follow the small crowd to the homestead where the mother goat is calmly chewing on thatch. The newborn is set down beside her and promptly collapses into a dozy nap. The villagers murmur appreciatively, already offering suggestions for its name. One of them insists that names given during a waxing moon are better for travel. Another claims that anything named during a solar flare becomes too independent. No one knows if that's true, but it sounds impressive. A mainstream historical fact. In medieval Iceland, animal births were considered deeply significant. Livestock was more than food. It was wealth, warmth, and reputation rolled into one braying, cud-chewing package. A new goat meant new potential. More milk, stronger, trading position, possibly even dowry leverage in a future marriage negotiation. Births were often timed, recorded, and sometimes even blessed, especially if they occurred during holy days or key seasons like lambing time. The boy's family is visibly proud. A goat born at dawn is auspicious, tied to the Norse reverence. For transitions and thresholds, it's neither night nor day, a moment when the veil between known and unknown thins. You hear someone whisper, "This one's a liminal goat," which sounds like a bad indie band, but also kind of beautiful. You kneel beside the newborn and lightly touch its ear. It flutters in its sleep. The mother goat gives you a look that says no sudden movements or I scream. You nod respectfully, a quirky tidbit. Icelanders used to believe that animals born at twilight could understand human speech better than their counterparts. These animals were occasionally consulted before important decisions, often through a ritualized ask and observe method. If the goat turned left, it meant yes. If it sneezed, the question was too silly to answer. If it lay down mid-ritual, the elders took a nap break and reconvened later. Historians still argue whether these consultations were truly believed or simply a socially acceptable way to procrastinate hard decisions. Back at your hut, the incident inspires a small burst of productivity. You start drafting your own naming guide for the sleep-deprived goat owner, starting with Chapter 1. Never name a goat while it's screaming. Chapter 2. Don't name it after food you like. Because yes, oatcake is adorable until you get hungry. You doodle sample names in the margins, Hraffenbelly, Wolfang, a Twilight Tumbler. It's soothing work. You wonder whether medieval scribes did the same when their ink ran dry. Later, the boy who delivered the goat shows up at your doorway holding a small jar of sour milk and a question. How do you name something special without scaring it? It's a big question. You think for a moment, then answer. You whisper it when no one else is listening. Just once, and if it doesn't run away, it's the right name. He seems satisfied with that and thanks you with a half bow and a goat-like bleat. You're not sure if it's gratitude or an early descent into madness, but either way, you wave him off with a smile. That evening, a soft rain starts to fall. It dapples the thatched roofs and fills the buckets set outside each door. The village smells like damp earth and rising steam. From inside your hut, you can hear someone strumming a lyre. And for a moment, it feels like all of Iceland is suspended in the hush between notes. You light a candle and look again at your naming ledger. You add one more entry, Dawn Stripe, followed by Born in First Light, already wiser than me. You wonder what your own name might be if someone had given it to you like that. Not the one your parents gave, or the one carved into the family horn, but the name whispered just once by someone who'd seen you before you'd even opened your eyes. The candle flickers, then steadies. You hear a distant bleat, high, questioning. It's probably the new kid, waking up confused, wondering why everything is wet and full of stars. You whisper back just in case, "Don't worry, we're all confused." You wake to the sound of something knocking against your door. Not hard, just the gentle kind of nudge a goat might give when it's bored or slightly curious about breakfast. You shuffle to your feet, pull on your woolen cloak, and open the door just wide enough to peek outside. There it is again, the kid from yesterday, Dawnstripe, or at least that's what you're calling it in your head, staring up at you with that same bleary-eyed look you wear before your first cup of morning. Milk. The boy stands nearby with his arms folded, trying very hard to look responsible. He informs you that the goat has selected you for morning rounds. Apparently this is a thing now. You step outside, rubbing your eyes, and let the damp chill settle over your shoulders. The village is still quiet, rooftops steaming from the last night's rain, smoke trailing lazily from a few chimneys. The mountains in the distance look like they're trying to remember their names. The boy follows as the goat noses around, pausing at barrels, nibbling thatch, and once staring very seriously at its own reflection in a puddle. You start to see the point of the naming laws. If every goat was this eccentric and left unnamed, the confusion would be catastrophic. Here's a mainstream historical fact to chew on while you walk. The medieval Icelandic law code, known as Gragas, wasn't just about naming goats. It covered nearly every aspect of life, from inheritance rights to how close your neighbor could plant their privy to your well. The code was a living document, evolving over centuries as Iceland's political and religious landscapes changed. The goat naming bits weren't symbolic, they were practical, because names were everything. They linked the animal to its owner, to debts owed or paid, to family reputation, and even to gods. A well-named goat was proof you were a person of order, someone who knew where things belonged in the grand, hay-scented tapestry of life. You crouch beside Dawnstripe as it sniffs at a carved wooden post, and then sneezes dramatically, spraying your sleeve with fate. The boy laughs and hands you a rag. You wipe it off with exaggerated dignity. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you continue your walk. In some parts of Iceland, goat horns were painted with natural dyes to reflect the owner's family colors. This served a double purpose. One, as an identifier in grazing lands or markets, and two, because, let's face it, a blue-horned goat is just cooler than a regular one. Some even had symbolic patterns painted on, spirals for good luck, dots for fertility, wavy lines for protection from sea spirits. No one could prove if it worked, but everyone agreed the goats looked magnificent. Historians still argue whether this horn decoration was truly a widespread practice or limited to a few isolated regions. There's plenty of debate over the surviving fragments of colored horn found in peat bogs. Some claim it was ceremonial, others insist it was branding for trade. The truth, as usual, is likely tangled in both function and flair. Back at the boys' homestead, you help retether Dawnstripe while the mother goat eyes you with silent judgment. You accept a bowl of warm broth in thanks, then sit cross-legged in the yard, watching the mist rise from the hills like it's deciding whether to stay or drift off toward the sea. The boy joins you, a little less formal now, and begins listing every name he's considered for the goat. You nod sagely at Bruni and Flicker, but raise a brow at Pudding Face. He explains that it's an inside joke with the goat. Of course it is. You gently guide the conversation back to the laws, asking him what he's been told about the naming rules. He frowns in concentration and begins. The goat must be named within 3 sunsets of its birth, and the name must be spoken in the presence of a witness, not family, while touching the goat's left ear. You blink. That's oddly specific. Drugs. That's what my gran says, but my uncle says it's just about not calling every goat goatee and then expecting them to come when you yell. Both versions sound perfectly reasonable. Later, you return to your hut and pull out your growing bundle of notes. You jot down the boys' version of the naming ritual and sketch a little goat with spirals on its horns. Your handwriting has started to slant like wind-blown fences, but it feels right for Iceland. You wonder what rituals you've followed without noticing. Little things like always knocking twice before entering the barn, or leaving the last spoonful of stew in the pot for the ancestors. You didn't invent those things. They drifted down into you, the way the rain drifts into the moss. Absorbed, remembered. Outside, someone starts calling goats home for the evening. It's not exactly musical, but there's a rhythm to it. Sharp syllables and familiar tones, names echoing against stone and wood. Snudur, Vaka, Mosi. You realize with a start that you can now tell which goat belongs to which call. Somehow their names have woven themselves into your brain. You watch as Dawnstripe trots into view, the boy jogging behind. He's carrying a new, carved tag, wooden, etched with runes, strung on a bit of dyed cord. You raise a brow. She has a name now, he says, holding it out with a quiet pride. Want to see? You turn the tag over in your hand, feel the grooves of the carving. It says Ljósur, which he explains means light edge, for the pale streak on her head, and the way she always finds the edge of things to stand on. You nod solemnly. It suits her. The boy ties it gently around the goat's neck. She shakes once, flaring her ears, then flops onto the grass like a royal tired of ceremony. You both laugh, and the moment, brief as it is, feels complete. The name fits. The T. Law is satisfied. The goat, as always, remains unbothered. The next morning, the mist hangs thick over the fields, clinging to the thatched rooftops like a second layer of wool. You make your way to the village's central gathering spot, a kind of outdoor meeting ground where disputes are settled. Bread is traded, and once a month a man with an accordion who definitely can't play shows up and tries his luck anyway. Today, there's no music, only chatter. Their small group of villagers are engaged in a heated debate over a matter that, to you, seems both incredibly petty and strangely epic. A goat has allegedly been given an improper name. You pause at the edge of the group, ears perking at the phrase, unauthorized epithet. A wiry older man is waving a piece of bark with charcoal writing on it, his face flushed with either passion or the cold, or both. His opponent, a woman with a braid thick enough to be used as a tow rope, stands arms crossed, completely unbothered. Apparently, her neighbor's goat has been named Windbutt, which, while undeniably descriptive, is being challenged for mockery of natural forces. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. In early Icelandic society, name laws didn't only apply to humans and property animals, they were also tools to enforce social harmony. Names had to be appropriate not just by law but by local consensus. Insulting names or names referencing bodily functions could result in fines or forced renaming, especially if they were seen to provoke conflict or disrespect local spirits. The Scienti crowd has split into two informal camps: the humorists who believe windbutt is a harmless bit of pastoral fun, and the traditionalists who argue that nature names must be treated with reverence. You quietly join the edge of the humorists, not least because their side includes a man handing out roasted chestnuts. A quirky tidbit emerges from the debate. One of the elders mentions an old belief that if a goat bore a name referencing wind or water, it had to be tested against those elements before it could keep it. If the goat could endure a breeze without running or cross a stream without faltering, the name stood. Otherwise, it was deemed a challenge the animal hadn't earned. You might watch as one villager suggests taking windbutt to the nearby cliffside where the wind is strongest and seeing what happens. There's murmured agreement, and someone goes off to fetch the goat in question, who arrives a short while later looking, well, rather proud of herself, as goats often do. Her ears flap slightly in the breeze. No panic, no drama. She simply begins chewing the hem of a bystander's cloak. The traditionalists aren't convinced. She didn't face the wind, one insists. She side-chewed it. This might be the silliest hill anyone has ever tried to die on, but in Iceland, this is serious jurisprudence. Historians still argue whether such community tests and rituals around naming were codified practice or local tradition. Some scholars believe that informal oral law shaped much of rural life more powerfully than written rules, especially in matters involving animals. Others insist that written codes like Gragas dominated even the smallest naming choices. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between wind and whim. Eventually, a compromise is reached. The goat may keep her name if the owner promises to never carve it into wood or declare it aloud in a house of worship. The man with the charcoal bark sulks a bit but relents. As long as she doesn't breed a line of goats named Fartgale and Thunderbottom, he mutters. You make a mental note of those names, just in case. Later, back in the quiet of your own space, you reflect on how much weight a name can carry in this culture. How a single syllable, assigned to a creature who may or may not understand it, can shape neighborly relations, legal disputes, and even religious considerations. You realize that naming a goat is less about the goat and more about everyone around it. You pour yourself a warm cup of something vaguely spicy and sit on the threshold of your hut. Across the path, a child is practicing goat calls, some classic like bara, and others more experimental like zoop zoop. You admire the enthusiasm. Nearby, Lyosur stands on a barrel, head high, scanning the horizon like a tiny sheepdog who read too many epic poems. You call her name softly, and she flicks an ear in your direction. Not bad for a goat who, days ago, was just, "Hey you." You pull out your notes and scribble another line. The goat naming laws weren't about control. They were about acknowledgement. Of place, of personhood, of presence. A flicker of movement at the corner of your eye draws your attention. It's Windbutt again, now wearing a flower tucked behind one horn, being led gently back home by her smirking owner. You imagine what the saga poets might have made of all this. Low in the windswept hamlet of Mossvale, the beast Windbutt did stand firm against the gales, and her name was etched not in stone, but in memory. You chuckle. Or if you stay here long enough, you might write your own saga. Just goats, so many goats. The next day begins with a faint smell of fish stew and the gentle thump of someone chopping wood nearby. You blink awake, stretch, and sit up to find a note, a literal bark scroll, left by your door. It's smeared with what might be goat hoofprints and sealed with a fish spine jammed through a knot of wool. Charming. The message is short and scrawled in crooked runes. Court of Naming. Goat Hall. Bring opinions. Underneath is a sketch of what might be a goat or a very tired sheep. You've been summoned. You bundle into your cloak, still slightly damp from yesterday's mist, and trudge down the dirt path toward the villages. Long Hall, affectionately known as Goat Hall, because of the carved goat heads lining its eaves. Inside, the air is thick with smoke and anticipation. Villagers line the benches, and a flat stone in the center acts as a speaking platform. Part soapbox, part sacrificial slab, depending on the topic. A local elder with a chin like a cracked bowl calls for silence. The topic today, whether future. Goat names should require pre-approval, and who exactly gets to approve them? Evidently, Windbutt's case has shaken the social order to its flaxen roots. A mainstream historical fact clicks into your thoughts. In medieval Iceland, Gragas included incredibly detailed provisions on naming, both for people and animals. Names had to reflect honor, kinship, and social balance. You couldn't simply name a child after a living relative without permission. And animals. Their names carried less legal weight, but if publicly used, could still be grounds for insult or even litigation, depending on tone and intent. One man suggests a name jury, a rotating group of villagers responsible for approving propose goat names, much like they do with newborn babies. Another insists on a sacred naming stone, on which all names must be etched in charcoal, then left overnight to see if morning dew distorts them. If the dew blurs the name, he explains, it means the spirits reject it. There's a silence, as everyone digests that logic. You spot a few skeptical eyebrows. A quirky tidbit emerges from the back benches. A farmer claims his grandmother named her goat Moonbelly after dreaming the animal would give birth during a lunar eclipse, and swears it happened. He insists that dream-based naming rights be included in the new policy. His story is met with polite nods, and one whispered, "He's off his oats again." The meeting turns chaotic in the best medieval way. People standing, shouting, offering food as bribes. A small boy attempts to nominate his goat for Sir Fluffsalot, prompting laughter and one person muttering, "We are doomed." You take notes furiously, partly to keep up, and partly because you know this will make excellent pillow talk with Ljósur. Historians still argue whether Iceland's naming rules were meant to protect spiritual harmony or social hierarchy. Some believe the laws served as communal rituals, reinforcing cultural identity. Others think they were tools of control, ways to keep people and their animals tidy and traceable. Most agree that the obsession with naming reveals a society, that deeply valued narrative order, even in the mundane. Eventually, the elder slams a staff against the naming stone and calls for proposals. He invites a few respected villagers to step forward with suggestions. One proposes the following. Any goat name must meet 3 conditions. It cannot insult nature. It must contain at least one consonant not found in human names, and it must be declared aloud at sunrise with the goat present. This last condition is met with several groans, especially from the farmers who prefer their mornings quiet and goat-free. Still, the motion passes by murmured consensus. You watch the writing of the new law begin, not with pen or chisel, but with wool thread knotted into a pattern on a wooden loom. 1 thread per rule, 1 knot per word. It's how they record things here. Not for speed, but for memory. You lean back on your bench watching the loom dancer work, her hands flying with surprising grace. The rules weave into something almost poetic. No mockery of wind, consonant. Distinction, presence at dawn. A strange hymn of governance tied together by string. By the time the hall empties, the goats grazing outside have no idea they've just become part of a legislative revolution. Ljósur gives you a blank look, chews a stick and lies down in the mud with imperial confidence. You return home that afternoon to find a gift on your doorstep, a carved wooden plaque that reads, "Authorized name, Ljósur." Beneath it, in smaller script, "Approved by the Council of Thread and Wind." You hang it above your sleeping mat, proud and also deeply amused. Your goat is now not only legally recognized, but culturally enshrined. As evening falls, the village slips back into its normal rhythm. Children practicing goat calls again, now with stricter supervision. Someone arguing with a bird over stolen berries and a pair of teens trying to sneak off to name a pig without permission. You recline under your roof of woven reeds and watch the last of the sun spill across the valley, dyeing the goat hills gold. Names, you think, aren't just labels. They're stories waiting to be told. whether in lore, in dreams, or in the quiet bleat of a creature who knows exactly who she is. Oh, wake to hooves, not metaphorical ones, actual clattering, impatient hooves circling your hut like a fuzzy omen. Liosur is in full spiral, snorting and stomping as if rehearsing for a theatrical rendition of The Storm Inside Me. You flee, emerge blinking, hair askew, and find her glaring at a pile of seaweed someone's left outside your door. It's a prank, clearly. Possibly even a protest. Someone is unhappy with the new naming laws. Over breakfast, barley mash with a suspicious amount of mint, you chat with a neighboring farmer. He suspects it was the pig-owning teens from yesterday, angry that their porcine friend was denied the name Mudpocalypse. You both agree. Tempers are fraying. And that's when the real gossip hits like a hailstone to the temple. Someone has challenged the new goat naming rules in court. A formal appeal has been lodged with the local thing, a traveling assembly of law speakers, jurists, and shouty observers who gather periodically to resolve legal conflicts. It's part courtroom, part village festival, part open-air brawl, with the occasional poetry reading. And in 2 days' time, it's coming here. A mainstream historical fact hums into focus. Iceland's Althing, founded in 930 CE, is one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world. Local things, smaller offshoots, handled day-to-day disputes. People would travel miles on horseback, by foot or sled, camping together, while debates raged over property lines, inheritance, and even duck theft. Laws were recited aloud from memory by the Logsogumadur, the law speaker, and disputes were settled through a mix of legal logic and intense passive aggression. You realize that for all the jokes, this is now a national matter. Someone somewhere believes that goats deserve different naming rules or perhaps no naming rules at all. Radical. You spend the day preparing. Liosur is brushed, fluffed, and oiled like she's heading to a goat wedding. You sew a ribbon into her mane, not for style, but as an exhibit. This is, after all, Exhibit A, the lawfully named goat. You also reread the original naming knots woven during the council. They're hanging in the communal hut now, guarded by a grandmother who claims she can see the future in tangled string. She tells you that change is coming, then hands you a half-eaten turnip as payment for listening. You accept it graciously. It's a thing, a quirky tidbit you recall. In some parts of medieval Iceland, unresolved disputes were once symbolically tied using actual knots of animal gut or grass. The case wouldn't be considered closed until the knot was untied or ceremonially burned. It's why the phrase knotty problem had very literal roots. By nightfall, you've composed your testimony, equal parts serious legal argument and slightly dramatic personal story involving goat pride and neighborhood harmony. It ends with a declaration: no creature should be denied a name that sings. You feel proud, also slightly ridiculous, but this is Iceland. Drama is weather. The next morning dawns damp and full of nervous chatter. The thing arrives in procession. 12 law speakers in wool cloaks, a donkey carrying a chest of law stones, not used, just symbolic, and a boy juggling fish for reasons unclear. A crowd gathers as the law speakers settle onto a circle of carved stones. They unroll a length of linen inked with the original Gragas, the medieval law code, and begin reading. People yawn. Someone makes tea. Historians still argue whether the performance aspect of Icelandic law served justice or just spectacle. Some say the public display helped cement shared values. Others argue it was a kind of theater, meant more to keep people entertained and intimidated than enlightened. Either way, the pageantry remains, and today you're part of it. You are called to speak. Your voice wavers at first, then finds its rhythm. You describe the council, the debates, the dew on the name test. You quote the grandmother, the child, the pig teens with permission. You end by introducing Liosur, who trots forward on cue and bows. Someone claps, she bleats. Then the challenger steps forward. It's not a farmer, it's the regional law speaker himself. He argues that the council's naming knots are frivolous, that dew is not a legal metric, and that goats should not hold quasi-sacred status over, say, geese or decorative chickens. He proposes that names should be non-binding until the animal reaches 1 year of age. a probationary name period. The crowd murmurs. The donkey snorts. You rebut, pointing out that identity is formed early, that Liosur clearly knows who she is, and that naming delays can result in social confusion. How do you shout warnings to an unnamed goat, you ask? With interpretive dance, people laugh. The law speakers confer. A final vote is called. They step away to consult the fjord, a thing euphemism for eating flatbread and arguing, in whispers. You wait, holding your goat's leash, whispering encouragement like remember to look dignified and don't eat any scrolls. Finally, the decision is returned. The naming law stands. But with a small amendment, names must now be declared in front of 3 witnesses, one of whom must be a bird. No one knows why. It passes with unanimous laughter. As the crowd cheers, you lift Liosur in celebration. She tolerates it for exactly 3 seconds before trying to eat your sleeve. A fair response. That evening, a feast is held. There's music, storytelling, and someone performing goat impressions that slowly morph into dance. You sit by the fire, with a full belly, warm cider in hand, and Liosur asleep at your feet, her nose twitching like she's dreaming of names yet to be known. Later that night, with the embers of the celebration still glowing under the weight of stories and cider, you wander down to the fjord. It's quiet now, just the gentle suck of waves on sand, the moon mirrored like a silver coin flattened against the water. Liosur pads beside you, her hooves muffled in the damp moss, ears flicking at the occasional owl call. You sit on a flat stone and trace the grain of a nearby driftwood log, still feeling the buzz of the thing's outcome. You half expect the goat to say something wise, like a Norse oracle disguised as livestock, but instead she sneezes and knocks over a tin cup someone left behind. Goat wisdom is subtle. By morning, news of the ruling has traveled faster than spring. Melt. Across the village and beyond, naming ceremonies are held with sudden urgency. Children parade around with birds in hand. Magpies, ducks, even one confused raven tied to a gentle leash, as they whisper names over their newborn animals with great solemnity. A mainstream historical fact rises to meet the absurdity. Icelanders often held naming feasts when children were officially given their names, a practice called Nafnfest. These were sometimes modest affairs, other times lavish events signaling both identity and intention, who the child was and who they might become. Some modern scholars trace the cultural reverence for naming directly back to these medieval customs. It turns out, naming goats with ceremony and avian witness isn't so far off. You find yourself roped into helping officiate a goat naming triple, header. One kid is named Thistle for its unruly curls. Another receives Pondskip, an homage to its accidental bath. The third is Sigrun the Loud, a title earned from its tendency to bleat every time a shadow passes. You scrawl each name into a soft strip of birch bark, tying it gently around the neck like a badge of honor. Nearby, a grandmother insists on throwing small flowers at each goat to seal the name. No one argues. Then comes the unexpected petition. A neighboring clan, previously skeptical of the whole naming affair, arrives unannounced with 6 unnamed animals: 2 goats, a pig, a sheep with an eye patch, and curiously a fox on a leash. They say they've reconsidered. They want in. You scramble to find extra bark, rope, and a reasonably obedient seagull. The fox is named Mistfang, which no one questions. The sheep becomes Old Eye, a title it seems to carry with haunted dignity. The pig is dubbed Waddle King, and the goats are named Rocksprout and Cloud Rumble, respectively. Someone suggests the Namekeeper as your new title. You shrug, but secretly, it feels right. A quirky tidbit floats into your memory. In one medieval saga, a man was gifted a magical goat that could recite genealogy backwards, but only when fed fermented fish. The story ends with him forgetting a cousin's name and being cursed with hiccups for a year. Historians think it's metaphorical. You're not so sure. That night you fall asleep with the wind carrying distant bleats and the occasional celebratory drumbeat. It's not quite peace. It's not quite chaos. It's somewhere in between, a balance like the perfect goat name. The days roll onward. Naming becomes a natural part of life. The practice spreads faster than salted cod rumors. villagers tie names into their herds' routines like braids in a child's hair. One particularly artistic soul begins etching names onto stones and placing them along the trail, forming a goat walk of fame. You even start offering naming consultations. People arrive with goats, chickens, and once a very hopeful turnip farmer. You sit with them, ask a few guiding questions, observe the creature or vegetable, and propose 2 or 3 solid options. Does your goat leap when it hears thunder? You ask one puzzled boy. Yes, he replies. Then she is storm hop. He nods like you've unlocked a part of his soul. Historians still argue whether medieval Icelanders placed more value on names than actions, or if the reverse was true. Some claim that names were destiny, etched in the air before a baby's first cry. Others suggest they were merely useful signposts, liable to shift if a person's life veered unexpectedly. The truth, as always, probably lives in the middle, clutching a naming ribbon and a bowl of goat milk. By midweek, a new problem arises. People want renaming rights. Not everyone is happy with their first choices. One girl insists her goat no longer feels like a pebble. He's clearly matured into a ridgefang. The council reconvenes, this time under a weather-beaten tarp during a sudden downpour. You all argue gently over whether renaming counts as disrespect or divine correction. The grandmother weighs in. If the goat tells you its name changed, you listen. It's settled. Names can evolve, but only with clear evidence and at least one dramatic incident involving weather. That night, you draft a new naming amendment. It reads, if one's goat should, over time, reveal a truer essence, be it through courage, storm chasing, or exceptional cheese production, it may earn a revised name, provided said name is spoken aloud at sunrise, in front of a witness. Bearing feathers, it's ridiculous, it's perfect. It passes unanimously, and so naming becomes an art, a ritual, a living story stitched into the rhythm of village life. You, the namekeeper, drift between homes, helping the quiet speak through titles. Not because the law demands it, but because the village has come to love the song a name can sing. By now, the naming of goats, and really all creatures with enough personality to merit it, has become such a central part of village life that it starts showing up in surprising places. Someone paints a mural on the side of the old meeting hall, a swirl of goats, ducks, and geese, each with golden halos and scrolls beneath their hooves declaring their names in florid script. One goat, Cloud Rumble, looks particularly smug. Beneath the mural, someone has scratched the phrase, he who names remembers. One day, a trader arrives from the southern coast, his boat heavy with seal fat iron nails and dyed wool. He claims he's heard of this strange northern village, where goats are not only named but given titles. He laughs when he says it, but the laughter fades when he sees the name-tagged herd wandering the fjord side, each one seemingly more majestic than the last. The trader leaves 2 days later with a new goat named Siphon, and a grin he can't quite explain. You don't think much of it until a letter arrives weeks later, scrawled on cured fish skin, sealed with birch tar. It's from another village far to the west. They've heard of the tradition. They want guidance. How, they ask, do we begin naming our sheep? A mainstream historical fact emerges from your memory. Iceland, throughout the medieval. Hjörta was a loose collection of farmsteads and villages connected by long trails, letters, and the passage of oral law. News spread slowly, but once it did, it stuck, folded into customs that might outlive even the reasons behind them. This isn't just about goats anymore. You sit by the fire and draft what becomes known as the Naming Starter Codex, a short set of principles scribbled on thin slats of birch, tied with sheep's wool, and carried by messenger bird to distant hamlets. It includes suggested rituals, how to interpret animal behavior, and one page devoted entirely to naming emergencies. If an animal refuses all names, wait 3 days, then try again during a rainstorm. The codex becomes something of a legend. A quirky tidbit arises here. There's a tale of a man who named his goat after a lost lover, only for the goat to follow him everywhere, bleating melodramatically whenever he flirted with someone else. It got so bad, he had to rename her Dignity just to move on. This, oddly, is cited in the Codex under the section titled Avoiding Emotional Entanglement in Titles. You travel now more than you stay home. Villages invite you to officiate naming ceremonies, resolve disputes, or help choose between three final contenders for a particularly obstinate pig. One day, a sheep is named Woolvilda the Unshorn, and you quietly swear that's the best name you've heard all season. Historians still argue whether medieval Icelanders ever developed formal institutions to govern such fluid cultural norms you recall as you tramp through the snow to another feast, or whether those roles simply emerged, filled by whomever was foolish and friendly enough to say yes. You know which one you are. One night, beneath a bright moon and a sky too vast to hold any worries, you're called to a cliffside farmstead. A boy's first goat has gone missing. His name was Gullstripe, the boy whispers. I think he got caught in the ice storm. You find the goat the next morning, cold but alive, trapped between two rocks. You carry him back wrapped in your cloak, the boy cries. Gullstripe bleats softly. The world feels righted. You think maybe this is why names matter. Not because they change the world, but because they mark it. They give us a way to care. Weeks pass. You're honored with a carving on the village's storytelling pole. A simple, wooden depiction of you crouching beside Ljósur, a name scroll in hand. The listener of names, it reads, though someone else has clearly scratched Goat Whisperer underneath in lighter strokes. You laugh, then sit beneath it for a long time. Later, at another thing, a new idea is proposed. What if children could name themselves at a certain age? Not just be named at birth by parents or kin, but choose their own title once they've done something worth remembering. It causes a stir, as these things do. But the logic catches on. Soon, a girl who once fell into the river while trying to rescue a floating egg declares her name is Swiftcurrent. Another, who regularly wins foot races even in snow, becomes Fleetheel. The village adapts. Names aren't fixed anymore. They're lived into. It's an evolution. And you're just glad to witness it. Sometimes you catch yourself watching. Ljósur chew on moss and wonder if you named her, or if she named you in her own quiet goat way. Some mysteries are best left undisturbed. That night, someone places a smooth stone beside your door. Scratched into its surface is a single word, Nafungjafi, name giver. You place it on your shelf beside the birch tag from her first collar and fall asleep with a strange peace humming just beneath your ribs. But it's the quiet kind, the kind that makes the world feel freshly erased. A soft white blank page just waiting for scribbles of hooves and laughter. Ljósur is already outside, her breath rising in gentle clouds, chewing nonchalantly on an icicle. You stretch, your joints protesting like old floorboards, and step into the hush. The village feels smaller in snow, softer, like it's whispering to itself. Even the birds are quiet. The first footprints you see don't belong to any human. They're goat prints, wandering but sure, meandering toward the edge of the ridge. You follow them without urgency, past the familiar cluster of turf houses and the half-frozen stream that always chuckles at its own jokes. Up on the ridge, someone's built a snow goat. It's impressive, actually. 2 snowballs stacked, tiny twigs for horns, and a mouthline that curves with just enough sass to be believable. At the base is a tag. Snjórus, born of winter. You chuckle. Another name joins the family. A mainstream, historical fact bubbles up with your breath. Iceland's medieval winters were harsh and isolating, especially in the interior. But instead of retreating into silence, people used the dark months to tell stories, spin wool, sing songs, and create rituals that gave structure to long, unlit days. Naming was just one of many ways to keep the cold at bay. Back in the village, a small assembly has formed in the long hall. Today there's to be a recitation, a new naming poem composed for the midwinter solstice. You find a spot near the back, squeezing between a basket of hay and someone's sleeping dog. The elder stands. Her voice is low but steady, the kind of cadence that makes even rowdy goats turn their ears. She begins, "Name them not for pride, nor for fear, nor gain, but for the shape they make in memory's snow." It continues. Verses about brave hens and stubborn sheep, about cats who chased dreams and cows who predicted weather. You nod along, warmed by the crackling hearth and the familiar cadence of shared belief. A quirky tidbit sneaks in as she recites, "There's a rumored tale of a ram so ornery that he was renamed every season, depending on what havoc he'd caused. Firestarter, Fencebreaker, Wife Chaser. Each name etched briefly in the village's joke scrolls. No one's quite sure if he ever had a permanent one. The name changed, but the goat remained the same chaos." After the poem, everyone contributes a log to the hearth, one by one. No words, just wood. The fire grows fat and content, flames licking their way into the rafters. Then someone suggests a game. Recount the name of every animal currently living in the village. Bonus points for middle names. You think it's a joke. It isn't. The recitation goes long. Laughter thickens the room. Someone cheats by pretending to forget and making up a name that no one can disprove. Twinklethud III becomes an instant favorite, even though no such goat exists. Yet you excuse yourself before the debate over whether Sir Clopsalot counts as a formal title or affectionate nickname escalates into parliamentary procedure. Outside, the snow still falls. You wander toward the old storytelling pole. By now, more carvings have joined yours. There's a goat perched on a log, wearing what appears to be a small crown. Beneath it, Monarch of Munch. You shake your head. You're not even mad. It's art. As you lean on the pole, the snow begins to stick to your cloak. You watch Liosur trot up from the stream, a thin string of ice clinging to her beard. She stops beside you and blinks. "Snow again," you murmur. "You'd think we'd run out of ways to name it." She bleats as if to say, "Never." A historical debate flits through your memory. Scholars can't quite agree on whether medieval Icelandic communities use naming for purely practical purposes, like distinguishing livestock, or whether the practice had deeper animistic roots tied to Norse beliefs in spirits and fate. It's likely both. It's usually both. Back in your hut, you pull out the old naming codex. It's grown now, padded with stories, corrections, footnotes scrawled in charcoal by others. There's even a new page at the back, written in a child's shaky hand. Rules for naming worms. It has one rule. Ask first. You don't erase it. The codex is no longer yours alone. It's been passed, adapted, misunderstood, celebrated. That's what traditions do when they're real. They live beyond the hands that started them. Someone knocks. It's a girl in a red cap, holding a bird cage. Inside, a puffed-up raven, looking thoroughly unimpressed. "What should I name him?" she asks. You smile. "What does he act like?" She frowns. "Hungry." "Well then," you say, crouching to her level. "How about Bragifowl the Famished?" She considers, nods. The raven squawks, which is probably agreement. You close the door and jot the name on the registry. Entry Dr. 344. You pause, then add a note. Name subject to change upon personality shift. Because if there's one thing naming teaches you, it's that everything changes. Goats, people, you, but names, they remind you of where you've been. Later that week, you find yourself perched near the edge of the pasture, legs dangling off a flat stone, sun on your back. The snow has melted into rich mud and unexpected puddles. Liosur trots past you, proudly wearing a necklace made from braided grass and what appears to be someone's missing mitten. She's clearly upgraded herself to Spring Queen. No vote required. You're not alone. A cluster of children are gathered nearby, organizing what they call the Great Goat Parade. You can't tell if it's a holiday or just an excuse to dress animals in flower garlands. Either way, it's a hit. Some goats are cooperative, trotting along with dignity. Others stage sit-ins or dive nose first into the refreshment baskets. A kid chases after her escapee, yelling, "Come back, Dandelion von Headbutt." You decide that's the name of the month. A mainstream historical fact drifts in with the breeze. During medieval Iceland's spring thaws, communities often held gatherings called Varthing, or spring assemblies, where laws were reaffirmed and disputes settled. It was a time of transition between cold and warmth, quiet and bustle. Even goats, you imagine, notice the shift. Back at the Long Hall, a new announcement has been pinned to the naming board. It reads, "Names to be retired." Below are several entries. Munchbottom, Count Beepy, Goatee West, Mildred, used 7 times this month. Apparently a council has decided that names reaching peak repetition must be paused for variety's sake. You're not sure if this ruling holds legal weight, or is just the scribble of a particularly organized prankster. But it's already causing ripples. A girl stands defiantly next to her goat. He's always been Mildred, she insists, even before he was born. A crowd murmurs support. The debate swells, ending with an impromptu vote that results in the allowance of Mildred E8. Crisis averted. A quirky tidbit floats into conversation later, a tale of a goat so beloved that his name was engraved on a wooden cup used only during feast days. Whenever someone used it, they had to toast to Bjarkiba, or risk spilling, their next 3 drinks. Whether true or not, it makes people laugh and spill drinks anyway. So perhaps the curse works retroactively. You walk with a neighbor to the hillside pens where naming trials continue. Today's challenge, come up with a name using only Icelandic root words and 1 fruit. So far candidates include bananaskeg and blueberry froda. It's nonsense, but everyone's very committed. Ljósur sits beside you during judging, tail twitching in what you assume is approval. You wonder if she remembers her own naming day. Maybe it's like birthdays for people. Important once, then slowly folded into the quiet rhythms of daily life. Until something silly or beautiful brings it all back. A historical debate tugs at your thoughts. Were naming traditions strictly inherited from Norse culture, or did early Icelanders adapt? Them more creatively once isolated. Some researchers argue that legal codes suggest formal roots, but others point to oral traditions and the wilder names recorded in sagas as evidence of communal invention. Like most things, it's both. Structure and silliness, rules and rebellion. The sun begins to set in long streaks, pink and gold stretching across the sky like a fresco. The goats gather near the fence line, their silhouettes oddly majestic. Ljósur bumps against your knee. You scratch between her ears, and she closes her eyes like a cat. You murmur, "What would you name me, huh?" She bleats. You nod solemnly. Thought so. Back in the village, someone's posted a new poem near the well. A name is a cloak, a sound, a guess. It fits for now and changes dress. Tomorrow you might be someone new, but today your name will do. You smile and tap the parchment gently, then head home. On your way, you pass the storytelling pole. A new carving is underway, half-finished, lines crisp and tentative. It shows a goat mid-leap trailing a banner in its teeth. You recognize the beginning of letters, L-J-O. You don't say anything. You just walk a little slower, has he? You reach your door, the stars begin to bloom. One by one, quiet and deliberate, like names waiting to be spoken. Morning arrives on a hush of fog, the kind that softens edges and makes the world feel like it's dreaming. You stretch beneath your wool blanket, listening to the village come alive. Goats bleating in the distance, a door creaking open, someone grumbling about missing firewood. You rise, pat down your hair, and step outside into the damp breath of early light. Ljósur is already waiting, as if summoned by the idea of breakfast alone. She greets you with a nudge to the ribs, then trots off in a zigzag pattern that suspiciously avoids the puddle she pushed you into yesterday. The naming board is updated again, this time with a category called seasonal reversals. Apparently, a few villagers have decided to rename their goats every solstice, believing it brings balance. So now, Frosty the Fluff is Sunbeam Cinders, and Mudlegs has been reborn as Dry Leaf. There's also a tiny note in the corner. No reversals mid-season. This isn't a soup kitchen. A mainstream historical fact tiptoes in as you make your way to the meeting hall. Many medieval Icelandic communities followed a seasonal calendar that marked not just solstices and equinoxes, but halfway points between them. 4 quarters, 4 transitions. These times were often used for legal changes, land re-evaluation, and yes, even animal inventories. You reach the long hall just as a new rule is being proposed. It's titled, Decree Concerning the Sing-Song Naming of Herd Beasts. One of the elders stands beside a scroll, explaining that names with rhyming syllables have been causing confusion among the goats and their keepers. So from now on, he declares, no more names like Floofy Boo or Skippy Kippy unless they serve a specific ritual purpose. A murmur of disappointment ripples through the room. Someone objects, citing historical precedent in the saga of Flatnose, where a goat named Hum Hum played a pivotal role in confusing a band of thieves. The elder pauses, squints, and admits that yes, that saga does exist. But still, the motion passes. You leave the meeting half amused, half bewildered, and fully convinced that this is the most organized chaos you've ever participated in. Outside, a young boy walks by, dragging a large stick behind him and calling, "Flibber the Fourth." Come on, we have naming rehearsal. A quirky little memory surfaces from yesterday's bonfire chat. Someone swore that in one village centuries ago, goats were not only named, but addressed with honorifics based on age and behavior. So you'd have Sir Barkhoof the Kindly or Dame Butterhooves the Defiant. Whether true or not, the image has stuck. You wonder if Liosur would prefer her softness the stubborn. Later in the afternoon, you join a group hiking to the high pasture to visit an old goat keeper, known simply as Airy. Her goats are known far and wide, not for their behavior, which is erratic, but for their names, which are exquisite. Each one feels like it was lifted from a lost epic. Cloudforge, Embermane, Thistlekin, Moondrift. She welcomes you with a nod and hands you a carved slate board. "Try it," she says. "Name one of mine." You scan her herd and settle on a shaggy white goat with spiral horns and an oddly regal strut. You write, "Queen Mumble of the Mist." Irie squints at the slate, then at the goat. "Fair," she says. She's been asking for a title. The day softens into evening. You sit beside Irie on a log while she braids grass into little loops. "Names," she says, "are like pockets. Everyone wants more, even if they don't always use them." A scholarly debate floats to mind. Quiet, but present. Historians still argue whether Iceland's medieval naming laws were primarily about order or identity. Were they meant to track animals for trade and inheritance, or were they ways of recognizing personhood in beasts that shared your daily life? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe they were just bored during the long dark and needed something to do that wasn't knitting. On the way back to the village, you pause to rest at the crest of a hill. Below, the fields stretch like patchwork, goats scattered like lazy punctuation, marks across the sentence of the earth. You take a breath, long and slow. The cold air bites, but it's the kind that wakes you gently instead of chasing you inside. Liosur joins you moments later, head bumping against your hip, eyes curious. You scratch her behind the horns and say, "We should rename you every season," she snorts. "Okay," you amend. "We'll rename the idea of renaming you. Compromise?" Back in the village, the first stars begin to show themselves. Someone's playing a soft tune on a wooden flute, and children chase each other between houses with bells tied to their cloaks. You sit by the fire pit, sipping from a cup of warm honey milk, and someone leans over to ask, "Did you hear about the goat who learned to bow on command?" You shake your head and the story begins, not because it needs to, but because that's how the night moves forward here. Not with purpose, but with pleasure. And over in the pen, Liosur curls up under a blanket woven with the village's insignia. A tiny goat rearing up with mischief in its eyes and a ribbon around its neck, probably named Mildred. The final morning dawns not with a bang or a drama-laden thunderclap, but with the gentle clink of tin cups and the rustle of hay. You're already awake, just barely, listening to the faint snores of someone 2 doors down and the odd rhythm of goat hooves on packed earth. Liosur is snoring too, you think, though it might just be the sound of her dreaming about dramatic entrances. You stretch, wiggle your toes in the blanket's warmth, and let yourself linger a bit. This is the last day of naming week, and somehow that means you've become something of a local celebrity. Not quite a goat bard, not quite a historian, but somewhere delightfully in between. Breakfast is a mess of sweet porridge and hard bread, and someone hands you a berry compote so rich it makes your eyelids twitch. You eat while watching a teen. Try to train her goat to respond only to compliments. "Glorious marshmallow of wisdom," she yells, and the goat turns with military precision. There's a final meeting at the naming stone, a large basalt slab etched with generations of goat names, the kind of place where big announcements are made and sleepy children are accidentally tripped over by eager elders. Today they're adding the new names of the year, voted on by villagers and blessed with a goat's nose print pressed in clay. You watch as the names are carved with steady hands. Spindlehoof, Echo Muffin, Thornsnort, and yes, Liosur finally getting her place in stone. You smile at the sight. She pretends not to care. but you're pretty sure she snuck an extra strut in her step just now. A mainstream historical fact winds into your thoughts like morning mist. In Iceland's medieval culture, carved records weren't limited to people. Legal logs, land agreements, and even livestock tallies were often inscribed in runic shorthand or painted on wood, preserved for both memory and accountability. Animals, particularly those tied to trade and livelihood, were part of the written world in ways that surprise most modern minds. Next comes the closing ceremony. Not formal, not loud, just a village gathering in a circle around a large fire pit. There's storytelling, of course, and songs, mostly in harmony, sometimes in enthusiastic defiance of key signatures. You're invited to speak, and after much coaxing and one particularly smug look from Liosur, you do. You talk about your arrival, your confusion, your laughter, and how the ridiculousness of goat naming somehow led you to understand a little more about community. You don't get too sentimental, just enough. There's cheering, but also some polite bleating, which you pretend is applause. Then comes the quirky bit, the closing game. It's called Name That Goat, and it involves blindfolding volunteers, spinning them around, and having them identify goats based only on touch and personality. You are, to no one's surprise, terrible at it, but it doesn't matter. You're laughing too hard to care. Historians still argue whether such festivals truly happened in Iceland's medieval age, or if they were embellished later through oral tradition. There's little written proof, but lots of hints. Lineage, poems, references in saga footnotes, and marginalia in monastic records that mention festum capre or goat feasts. Whatever the truth, the spirit feels real enough. As the sun lowers behind the mossy cliffs, the fire is rekindled for one last shared meal. Platters of root vegetables, salted lamb, and baked apples pass from hand to hand. You sip from a clay cup of something fermented and surprisingly fruity. Children fall asleep in laps, goats curl beside benches, and the sky turns into velvet stitched with stars. You sit beside Liosur one last time. She's lying on her side, chewing absent-mindedly on a scrap of your cloak. You let her. It's the least you can do. And in the final quiet, you remember something Irie said. A name is a kind of tether, not to trap, but to hold. Just long, enough to share something true. It's been a strange wool-covered, laughter-laced week, and you wouldn't trade it for anything. Word count 1076, wind down 300 words. As the last embers of the fire crackle softly, the world begins to hush once more. The stars shimmer with a kind of gentle amusement, as if they too heard every silly goat name and cheered from above. You lie back on your straw-stuffed bedroll, head heavy, heart light, and listen to the night breathing through mossy stones and the soft shift of animals settling into sleep. The air smells of wood smoke and thyme, with a hint of wool that seems to follow you now like a loyal scent mark. In the distance, someone sings a lullaby, low and slow, the tune weaving into the air like spun flax. You let your mind wander, slow and lazy, retracing the paths you walked, the naming board scribbles, the high pasture silliness, that first stubborn headbutt from Liosur. Every sound, every moment is softened now, like cloth warmed by firelight. Your body sinks breath by breath into the rhythm of sleep. There are no more names to remember, no meetings to attend, just the quiet memory of joy, of gentle absurdity, of old laws and new laughter. The world fades slowly, kindly, and somewhere nearby a goat dreams beside you.